Now, I've talked about this before, but George Orwell probably named his infamous book 1984 after the Fabian Socialist, as after all, they were founded in 1884 and they were explicitly proponents of gradualism, of change over time progressively through the decades, and so a century would be a very notable marker. Like a lot of people, I was taught 1984 in high school, and it was actually the book that my English teacher really taught us how to analyze literature with, how to read between the lines and pick things apart. And like a lot of people, I had to write an essay comparing 1984 to Brave New World and answering the question of which one was more likely to come true, which dystopian future was more imminent. But it took me many years to realize the connections behind the scenes of those books. George Orwell, aka Eric Blair, had actually been a pupil of Aldous Huxley. I believe he learned French from him at the Eton boarding school. And by that time, I realized who Aldous Huxley's family was. T.H. Huxley, the bulldog of Darwin, his brother Julian Huxley, and the role they played in eugenics and their promotion of the New Age, the New Order of the Ages, and also their connection to H.G. Wells and similar figures, and their connection to Fabian socialism. And back when we were first reading 1984, of course, one of the questions that came up was, what does the title mean? Where did Eric Blair, George Orwell get the idea for it? And the most common story you'll hear is that, well, he finished it in 1948 and he and his publisher talked about it and they didn't know what to call it, so they just inversed the numbers 1948, 84, end of story. They decided against his alternate title, The Last Man in Europe. But of course, that story doesn't make any sense and there's no proof that it's true. Although it's never been explained, a much more likely explanation comes in the fact that his wife, Eileen Blair, before they had met when she was still Eileen O'Shaughnessy, had just read Brave New World, which was published in 1932, and she wrote a poem in 1934 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of her high school, Sutherland High School magazine, that she called End of the Century in 1984. It's a relatively short poem with a death, birth, and phoenix section where society basically dies and the old authors, Shakespeare, Yeats, Horace, Virgil, and what have you, are outmoded and their books are dusty and distant. And in the New Age, his wife hints at crystal palaces and sun-bronzed scholars who learn by tuning their thought to telepathic Station 9, where they learn the useful sciences and the arts of telesalesmanship. In the Phoenix section, she connects old authors with new and says that Huxley shares Platonic food, while Bacon's colleague is Einstein, and so forth. At any rate, Orwell's wife was only 39 years old when she died, which happened to be in the final year of World War II. And pretty much the only major thing Orwell did with the rest of his life was write 1984, and it makes sense that his title was in many ways a tribute to the poem she wrote, End of the Century 1984. And again, Orwell came to know Aldous Huxley personally and studied under him, and later Huxley issued basically a rebuttal to 1984, and Huxley, who moved in very high circles, introduced George Orwell to a lot of very influential people, many of them part of the Fabian Socialist. And the Huxleys themselves were involved, but maybe not official members. Bertrand Russell was involved, and they were very close with the founders, including H.G. Wells, who was very much a Huxley acolyte himself, having basically risen to prominence under T.H. Huxley's tutelage. So through that connection, George Orwell came to know a lot of these people and came to despise a lot of them and talk bad about them. Well, the first publication by the Fabians in 1884 was Why Are the Many Poor? And it talked about how to remedy by reallocating wealth of the rich and powerful, dismantling structures, and building social institutions that were supposedly more equitable. And it contains the famous quote that is attributed to the Roman general Fabius Maximus, from where the Fabians get their name, as well as their emblematic gradualism Why are the many poor proclaimed, quote, for the right moment you must wait, as Fabius did most patiently when warring against Hannibal, though many censured his delays. But when the time comes you must strike hard, as Fabius did, or you will be waiting in vain and fruitless. And so that relates directly to one of the Fabian's several logos, which is that of a turtle, an angry tortoise, slowly moving along. How does he beat the rabbit in the race to the finish line? Well, he moves steadily, progressively, gradually. But when I strike hard. And so the Fabians were in favor of a full move into socialism and a takeover of the state and society, but from a practical standpoint, they thought it should be implemented gradually. But there's also their coat of arms, which is quite telling, and that is a depiction of a wolf in sheep's clothing, a deception. And reading from the website ForbiddenSymbols.com on the Fabian Society reads, according to author John Perdue, the logo of the Fabian Society, a tortoise, represents the group's predilection for a slow, imperceptible transition to socialism, while its coat of arms, a wolf in sheep's clothing, represented its preferred methodology for achieving its goal. But the wolf in sheep's clothing symbolism was later abandoned due to its obvious negative connotations. And even though Orwell, aka Eric Blair, was very much a socialist and a proud socialist, he took very serious issue with a lot of the leading socialists, especially from the Fabian corner. And he saw them as basically middle class and upper class and snobbish and hateful of the poor and very, very cold. There was actually an essay written by Arnold Toynbee, the longtime president of the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and he wrote an essay in his book Acquaintances about the Webbs titled Are They Human?, where he lays out all these examples of how they're very cold human beings, and everybody knows that, and they've called them out, and they're very calculating. But a couple times he saw them be nice to people when they didn't really have to be, and that was when he knew, yeah, they're human. And Orwell saw a lot of the same behavior, and he wrote a great deal about this in his book The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published in 1937, about a year, I think, before he published his other essay on Wells, Hitler, and the World State, where he just laid out all the things wrong with H.G. Wells' thinking and undermining Hitler. In the same sort of time period in The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell takes to task George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs, all of whom were founders of the Fabian Socialists, who founded it, by the way, along with Edward R. Peace, who was very wealthy and actually worked on the London Stock Exchange before he received a huge inheritance that allowed him to basically retire and start funding all these labor and socialism causes. Very rich irony. Anyway, Orwell writes in chapter 11, meanwhile, what about socialism? And he writes a lot about socialism. He's in favor of socialism, but he's extremely critical of their complete detachment in the literary circles and the academia circles and the literary circles from the working people, the honest and hardworking people who they see as dirty and unclean and unlearned and just have this whole attitude. And after he takes George Bernard Shaw to task for not only being snobbish and demeaning towards working class people, but for supporting dictators and even suggesting that poverty and the habits of mind created by poverty are something to be abolished from above by violence if necessary, as well as his support for both Stalin and Mussolini, he gets into Miss Sidney Webb's autobiography, which would be Beatrice Webb, where Orwell says, quote, you get the same thing in a more mealy-mouthed form in Miss Sidney Webb's autobiography, which gives unconsciously a most revealing picture of the high-minded socialist slum visitor. The truth is that to many people calling themselves socialist, Orwell writes, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which, quote, we, The clever ones are going to impose upon, quote, them, the lower orders. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to regard the book trained socialist as a bloodless creature entirely capable of emotion. Though seldom giving much evidence for affection for the exploited, he is perfectly capable of displaying hatred, a sort of queer theoretical in vacua hatred against the exploiters. And he goes into how they basically denounce the bourgeois and the upper class lifestyle, yet they live it themselves. They ascribe to it. They come on in. They live that way. And hardly would they ever be caught dead, with the mannerisms of the poor and working class. They wouldn't slurp their soup. They wouldn't drink after people. They saw those people as disgusting. So yeah, wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, this is a deceptive movement. And, H.G. Wells even published a book called The Open Conspiracy. And, it sounds open, but it's also very deceptive. They state it openly, but they bring it in quietly, gradually, so that nobody notices. I mean, it's evil, but it's genius, basically. And of course, Orwell doesn't point out that Shaw has supported dictators just in order to discredit him. This is central to the deception, the wolf in sheep's clothing, that the Fabians represent a progressive socialist society, which was a sort of popular umbrella view, but more in line with communists. They actually accept and in many ways promote dictatorship.
People who only know me from reading my books, or sometimes even from seeing my plays, get a most unpleasant impression of.
Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the two main founders of the Fabian group, openly supported imperialism and monopoly. They supported Britain in redistributing parts of Africa and creating a, British-led Cecil Rhodes state. They supported, corporate monopolies because they thought smaller groups just would be harder to work with, and they could theoretically make things better for workers under gigantic corporations, which we could see now in hindsight. They're just impossible, seemingly, to keep in check, But this is the kind of stuff they had in mind. And so, as H.G. Wells, among others, makes clear, really the Fabian socialists aren't so much about empowering the poor people and bringing them up to par with everyone else. It's really about putting the state in charge. The real goal here is organization by collectivism, And this, I think, is at the heart of Orwell's critique of the Fabians and of their type of socialism, and why I believe he probably did name 1984 ultimately after the Fabian Socialist, and not just after his wife's poem about the end of the century, 1984, although it does give us a sort of connecting hint that it has to do with the century. And this shows in the book within a book within 1984, the outlawed Emmanuel Goldstein book titled The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. Oligarchical collectivism, a form of collectivism that ultimately benefits the oligarchy. Sold to people on Marxist ideas of communism, sold to people as a friendly socialism that would level things for the poor and make things nicer, but ultimately working to the benefit and the concentration of power of the ruling oligarchy. Orwell was very critical of the elitist ties of the Fabians, and again, I think it shows in the banned book within a book in 1984, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. That's the wolf in sheep's clothing. They sell themselves on socialism, but they're really oligarchical collectivists. Collectivists not for the benefit of the people, not even for the benefit of a single dictator, but for the oligarchy, the ruling class, the very tiny concentrated power, the 150 people or whatever number you want to ascribe to it, who rule the world. The party seeks power not for the people, but entirely for its own sake. They're not interested in the good of others. They're interested solely in power. They don't want wealth and luxury for the general people or for them to live a long life or be happy. They want power for the sake of power. And that's what Orwell hits upon in the climax of the book. What pure power means you'll understand presently, he writes. We're different from all the oligarchies of the past in that we know what we're doing. All the others, even those who resembled ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just round the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. And that's the warning of Orwell about collectivism. And so I've studied this group, the Fabian Socialists, off and on for 13, 14 years now. And it's been fascinating and terrifying because you realize that while they were just one small, tiny group that their inner core kind of broke apart, but the group continued. It's still around today as a political party. We actually filmed it while we were visiting London. We went by the London School of Economics that was officially founded by the Fabian Society. The core members who founded the group, Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, and this guy Graham Wallace, also with the help of the other founder, Edward R. Peace. They founded that school in 1895, and it's been very politically motivated. There's definitely an agenda, and they've trained a lot of really famous and well-known people and very influential cogs in society. And we filmed the outside of that. We even filmed their logo of the arduous beaver. Beaver. No, it's a seal. That's it. Beaver stands for industrious building. And there's sort of scholars on the old logo suggesting that they were, so studious in studying everything. And that was pretty interesting. We walked by and they had some propaganda posters for climate change with a polar bear, on a melting ice cap and that kind of thing. And, it seems par for the course for a group that was founded supporting eugenics and supporting collectivism and, and who have a wolf in sheep's clothing as their emblem and a gradualist turtle as their logo. And we filmed that and we left, and I was reminding Melissa about the Fabian window, which depicts the actual founders, again, the Webbs and George Bernard Shaw. It shows them hammering away and literally remaking the world closer to their heart's desire. Literally pounding out the New World Order, literally reshaping the world according to the dictates of their very sly and indiscreet society. And that really kind of underscores what this group is all about, based on my research anyway. H.G. Wells actually said that for him, collectivism was a religion. It was the open aim of his open conspiracy. He wanted collectivism to be the opiate of the masses because it was a system that, just like George Bernard Shaw said, could feed them, could clothe them, could make sure they had plenty and that they lived well. It was a system that would provide for them, but it could also destroy them.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
This is what he said. This is a quote. Under socialism, you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed, whether you liked it or not. If it were discovered that you had not character and industry enough to be worth all of this trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner, but whilst you were permitted to live, you would have to live well. And what's living well? It's what they decide. living well is. It's not what you
It
decide.
was a system where the state was God, where the state itself was the system where power was to be invested, and that state had the power to sterilize people in the name of eugenics, and even to euthanize them in the name of efficiency, and in the name of finding people to be worthless from an economic standpoint, from an input-output standpoint, that they would basically sanction the death of people, not for being poor, not for committing a crime, but for the crime of not benefiting the state, of not producing value for it, and thereby having a negative value that warrants their death. It's a system that, as H.G. Wells said, puts the state, puts the collectivist system as the religion, and they've depicted this on a stained glass window, evoking a sort of religious piety. It's a stained glass window, has religious iconography and connotation. And this was designed by the playwright George Bernard Shaw and the writer. And it depicts, again, these founders hammering away at the world. The world is on their anvil. They're reshaping it just under their wolf in sheep's clothing coat of arms. And the caption reads, "Remold it nearer to the heart's desire." And then it reads lower down in a triangular shield, "Pray devoutly, hammer stoutly." And it shows 10 or so disciples on their knees praying before the books and tracts written by the group. Pray devoutly, while the inner circle, the founders, while they're hammering stoutly and remaking the world nearer to the heart's desire. They're reshaping the world and they're reordering things. They're using the ancient black magic of the blacksmith's hammer and anvil to reshape things as if they were Hephaestus in Olympus or what have you, It's a tremendous boast of power. And anyway, I was telling Melissa about that after we had filmed the London School of Economics, and we had rounded the corner, I think the night before, and saw the Fabian Society headquarters, which is now just basically a political party group. And they just have a plain sign on the outside. And she was looking it up on the phone, and she said, that stained glass window is on display inside the London School of Economics. So the next day, we worked our way back downtown, caught a cab. It was really bad traffic, I remember. And we walked over there, and we walked in, and, we just walked into the lobby. The place was open. They don't have anybody checking you or anything. It's a school. And we went up to the third or the fourth floor, I don't remember which, into the library where it was on display. And we walked in, and we were able to film at the real Fabian Socialist stained glass window. And the window shows what I thought looked like H.G. Wells, but it's really Edward R. Peace, again, who worked on the London Stock Exchange, came from an extremely wealthy family. He's there along with Sidney Webb. He and his wife, Beatrice, founded it, and they're next to George Bernard Shaw. And again, they're in this inner coterie, the elitist circle of the founders, above the masses, who are on their knees praying to the books and the ideas and the slogans of the group in the name of socialism and the name of collectivism, which H.G. Wells said would be a religion, that it was a religion to him, and that collectivism would be an opiate of the masses to the people, just as other writers have also said religion is the opiate of the masses. He now says collectivism would be, because, collectivism can provide.
George Bernard Shaw in 1910 and depicts Shaw, Webb, Wells, Peace, and other Fabians. That's pretty cool.
And for these masses, these devotees to this new world they're building, to the ideals of socialism and collectivism, they're on their knees praying to the various books that have been written under a slogan that says, "Pray devoutly, hammer stoutly," while the founders, Edward R. Peace, the banker, Sidney Webb, symbolically there as if he's Hephaestus, as if he's a magical blacksmith with the hammer, striking down on the world that's sitting on the anvil alongside George Bernard Shaw, who's also striking with the hammer. While others believe they're working towards a more equitable, fair for the poor kind of socialism, a friendly collectivism that provides, well, these people in the inner circle, they know that the real coat of arms is the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's a deceptive thing. They're talking about fairness for everyone, but here they're actually shaping it in the inner circle and literally remolding it nearer to the heart's desire. They're shaping the system of state around what they think people want, but ultimately, just as Orwell criticized, it's for the oligarchy. It's the oligarchical collectivism. So we got to see that thanks to Mel looking it up. And it's pretty interesting because it was designed in 1910 to commemorate the Fabian Society, and they made it into a stained glass. And for a long time, it was in the Webb's household, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, but it was stolen in 1978 from the Beatrice Webb house, which was in Dorking, UK, and it disappeared for 25 years until it showed up at a Sotheby's at an auction, and that's where they reclaimed it, and they brought it to the London School of Economics and put it on display where we got to see it. But when it was reintroduced, Prime Minister Tony Blair gave a speech and was part of a ceremony praising the history of the Fabians and where the Labour Party was going moving forward, because Tony Blair himself is a Fabian socialist. He's an official member of the Fabian Society, the organization we also saw in the city, which takes its roots from this wolf in sheep's clothing, opiate of the masses, collectivism, New World Order society. Moving slowly forward, so slow no one notices it, and seemingly no one's able to stop it, at the pace of a turtle winning a race against a hare. Interesting stuff, and something that Orwell was very perceptive about, along with other writers, very critical of, and something you should know about as well.
Maybe I'll take one more photo since you are.